All right, in this lecture, this first lecture, we have a few sort of big ideas to hammer out. First thing is we have to talk about the definition of art, and then after that, we're going to talk about what Renaissance means, where we're starting this class. All right, here's our definition of art. I'm going to say it quickly the first time, and then second time will be better for notes. Art is an idea, some kind of concept or feeling that is made manifest through some kind of medium, and that thing that is created adds to our understanding or enjoyment of life. All right, so let's break this down. The first thing to know about art is that it starts out with some kind of concept, something that is cerebral, something in the mind, some kind of feeling maybe, and then it has to be made into something, and that object is made through what's called a medium. And a medium can be very generic. You could say it's painting, or very specific, you could say it's oil paint, or very generic and say it's sculpture, or very specifically say it's limestone. And once you have that concept and it's made manifest through that medium, it has to add to our enjoyment or our understanding of life. So oftentimes we think of art as just being something that's beautiful, pretty to look at, but it's important that we see, especially in this class, that most of these works will lead to our understanding, not so much of our life, but of the life of the creator, the life of the patron, that's the person who paid for the work to be created, and our understanding of that particular time period in that particular location. So it's going to really sort of shed light on big historical movements and let us know more about the particular culture in which it was created. This class, as I said, starts in the Renaissance, and that's a little bit tricky because we're starting halfway through the story. So it'd be like reading a 400-page book and starting on page 200. We got to figure out what happened in those first 200 pages. Otherwise, the last 200 pages aren't going to make any sense. So we have to back up. We can't start in the Renaissance. We have to go way back deep into history to find out what is so spectacular first about the Renaissance, and then moving forward about each of the particular time periods. So we have to back up in order to move forward. Okay, so in order to do this, we need to go way back to ancient Greece and Rome. We have to go back to the classical world, or we also call it antiquity. A whole lot of names. You can call it Greco-Roman antiquity, the Greco-Roman world, the classical world, antiquity. There's a lot of different names to say kind of the same thing. This period is about 1,000 years. Our nice little timeline here brings us back to 800 BCE, which is before the Common Era. You may also see BC, which is before Christ. Usually I put it about 600, but 800 is fine. And then it moves us forward to the year 400 of the Common Era. So we're looking at a little over 1,000 years, about 1,200 years of history. You also may see this as AD. And so here's our sort of time of Christ, and then we sort of move forward. So Greco-Roman antiquity is about 1,000 years. And then at the fall of the Roman Empire, we start to the Middle Ages, also called the medieval period. And you'll notice it's also a nice, tidy 1,000 years, from about the year 400 to about the year 1400. So we have about 1,000 years of Greco-Roman classical antiquity. We have about 1,000 years of the Middle Ages. And at the end of the Middle Ages, around the year 1400, is when we start the Renaissance. So this is a nice visual to keep in mind these three big periods, because when this class starts, starting with the Renaissance, which comes at the end of the Middle Ages, and then we have to know a lot about Greco-Roman antiquity. So it's kind of confusing, these three. So this is a nice place to start. The Renaissance means rebirth. It is a rebirth of Greco-Roman antiquity, all the way back here. So our Renaissance is going to reject, move away from, and change from the aesthetic of the Middle Ages. Aesthetic just means that which you find sort of beautiful or pleasing to the eye. So the Renaissance is going to look at right on its heels at the Middle Ages, at the artwork of that period, and really reject that. And what it gives rebirth to is all the way back here to the classical world. So you can see how it's a little confusing. You can't just start at the Renaissance because you don't know what the Middle Ages look like or what classical antiquity looked like. So that's where we're going to start today. We've got to figure out what was so fabulous about Greco-Roman antiquity that these Renaissance artists wanted to look back to that time period and give rebirth to that particular aesthetic. So let's start looking at some images. First, we're going to see what Greece was like and what Rome was like, what their similarities were, and then we're going to see a big change when we move to the Middle Ages. All right, let's do that. Let's look at our first images. I'm going to bring up two Greek examples. Our discussion of Greco-Roman antiquity is going to center on humanism. Humanism is not a word that is not necessarily an art word. It is a philosophy. Humanism has or places a great interest on humanity, on man, in man's mind and man's body. The Greeks were the first to institute a humanistic worldview, where they saw that man was the measure of all things, that man was the highest form of creation. And when they strove to show us the body of man, they showed us a very idealized and very beautiful and very perfect view of man. When we look at these images, we can see that they're both about the same time period, about 480 BCE back in the Greek world and 450 here on the right. The thing I want you to see is the image on the left is a boy. He's called the Critios boy, the beginning of the classical period in the Greek world, and this is a warrior. The thing that I want you to know is that these are both images of men. That's important because previously, before the Greeks, before their humanistic worldview, monumental sculpture was of gods and not men. It may have been rulers, but the rulers were thought to be gods themselves. So it's important just looking at these images, not to just say, wow, he's beautiful and idealized and perfect and thin and young and all of that, but it's a monumental image of a man. So that is pretty significant. The thing about the Greeks, though, is that their images were these idealized views of the perfection of man. They're not specific men. They're very generic men. It's just the idea of the perfection and the beauty of man. Sculpture really shows us the perfection of man's body, but the Greeks also believed in the perfection of man's mind. When we look to the Romans, it seems to think, well, let's move up our warrior here. Let's put him up on the left and let's look at a good Roman example. When you first look at your Roman example here on the right, next to your Greek example here on the left, it's tempting to think, oh, he got older and he put his clothes on and he's kind of, old and stodgy looking. We can zoom in here on his face. Not exactly like the image there on the left-hand side. So it's tempting to look at our Roman example that comes on the heels of the Greeks and think, well, this is not humanism because he doesn't look like our Greek example of humanism. But what I want you to see is that both of these are humanism, just shown very differently by different cultures. While the Greeks believed in the beauty and the perfection of a young, idealized, athletic, and strong view of man, the Romans took this idea and ran with it. For them, they wanted to see real men, not idealized version of generic men, real men, and they were interested in how real men wielded their power in the world. So they showed men that were older. For them, older meant wiser. Had a little bit of years behind them. And so they are still very humanistic. They still see man as very powerful, but the Romans were just more imperialistic. They were interested in wielding their earthly power. So they took what the Greeks handed over to them and ran with it and made it their own. The Romans were also very commemorative. They liked to remember their ancestors. This is very humanistic, the idea that you should have a remembrance of people in your own family. So the Greeks and the Romans had works of art that were very naturalistic. They strove to show us sort of real bodies, whether idealized or more true to life. So when you look at works that are part of Greco-Roman classical antiquity, you see that they were really striving to get a lot of detail and to really sort of capture who that person was with a lot of very naturalistic details. This is how we really sort of characterize the Greek and Roman world. If you took this earlier version of this class, the class that comes right before this one, you would break down a lot of what it meant to be Greek and what it meant to be Roman. But this is sort of our overview of these two time periods. Now we see what our humanism looks like in the Greek and the Roman world. Now we're going to move forward a little bit to that period of the Middle Ages. So I'm going to show you two examples here coming up on the left and the right hand side. And hopefully you can see a great change here. So give me a second while I move my slides around here. Here we go. All right. These are examples from the Middle Ages. This is from the 12th century, which would be the 1100s. This is from before 1300, so we're getting towards the end of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages says goodbye to that humanistic worldview that we saw the Greeks and the Romans. This Middle Ages are the years, as we saw in our timeline, of about 400 to 1400. That means it is at the end of the Roman Empire. It starts at the fall of the Roman Empire. This is a purely religious worldview. The Catholic Church is our major patron. And so most of the figures that we see are of the Holy Family, a lot of the Virgin Mary and the image of Christ. And the images that we see wanted to now strip the images from all of that humanism. We wanted to have these religious and holy figures that dwelled in a religious realm. We wanted to have a purposeful separation between us, the earthly, sort of mundane dweller, and that of the holy figures. So we wanted to create this purposeful separation. So let's see how we do that. The first thing to see is that these images are not very naturalistic. They tend to be what's called stylized. Stylized means they're really pared down to their essential elements. So, for example, you see this face, there's a little line for the lips and a little line for the nose and these sort of almonds for the eyes. You're not getting a really naturalistic view of the Virgin Mary, but you're getting sort of a pared down version. The next thing to notice is that these images tend to be bathed in gold. There's nothing like creating an otherworldly, resplendent realm, like adding some gold. There's a couple of ways to do this, but the most common is the use of what's called gold leaf. Gold leaf are pounded out sheets of gold. So you can see how there's this sort of gold paint around the edges, but see how this really shines? This is called gold leaf. It's pounded out sheets of gold that are laid onto the image and then painted over. So then this is sort of painted. You can see the gold leaf here. It's that real sort of shimmery effect. These images here that you see on the left and the right hand side show us very nicely the style of the Middle Ages, and that style is called Byzantine. This style dominates from about the year 400 till we say goodbye to the Middle Ages in about the year 1400. If you took the earlier version of this class, you'd have a sort of a full view of this Byzantine world. But what you need to know is that this Byzantine style is very otherworldly. It's very sort of gold, resplendent, stylized figures that are purposely taking a step away from that humanistic worldview. It is a purely religious worldview in which we sort of see these figures dwelling in a world that is separate from ours. If I could put up another view here, if I could, well, let's see. Let me see if I can sort of pull up a view because I want to sort of show you where we are heading with this class. Let's put up our Greek example. And let's put up our medieval example here on the left and right. All right. So if I could put up a third slide here, and I put up my Renaissance slide, here's what we would have. We would have the subject matter from the Middle Ages, the subject matter being religious. It would be Catholic subject matter, because the Catholic Church is still going to be our major patron in the 14, 15, 1600s. So we're still going to keep religious subject matter. But we are going to give rebirth to the humanism of Greco-Roman antiquity. So it would be as if we had this image of the Virgin Mary and we infused all of this naturalism from this humanistic worldview onto this image, this holy image. So we're going to keep a little bit of the Middle Ages, that being the subject matter, but we're going to reject the way these figures are created, that very sort of stylized otherworldly view, and we are going to infuse them with a more humanistic worldview from Greco-Roman antiquity. We are, in essence, going to sort of humanize our religious subject matter. So that's where we're going to move in this chapter, and really for the next couple of chapters as we move throughout the Renaissance.